Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Nicholas Mifarishvili. I'm the director of Safe Futures Hub Solutions to End Childhood Sexual Violence, which is co-led by SVRI, Together for Girls, and the We Protect Global Alliance. I'm so delighted to welcome you all to our webinar today, which is actually third in a series, Voices from SVRI Forum 2024, Strengthening the Fields Through Shared Learning. The series is made possible through co-funding from the Australian Volunteers Program, and we are deeply grateful for their partnership with the SVRI and their continued commitment to advanced learning and field building. Through the webinar series over the past few months, we've unpacked some key findings from the Forum 2024, most recently exploring tech-facilitated gender-based violence and economic empowerment. If you missed any of those sessions, recordings are available on the Forum website, and the link will be shared with you in the chat shortly as well. But today, we are actually turning our attention to intimate partner violence and the power of new evidence to drive meaningful change. From what happens when partners report violence differently, to how witnessing IPV in childhood can shape lives across generations, to whether we are truly measuring what matters. I think today's presentations bring very fresh insights and also sharp questions to the conversation on IPV prevention and response. So just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Today's session will run for an hour. All sessions are being recorded and will be made publicly available on the SVRI and AVP's websites. Audience members are muted, but we'd love to hear from you. So please introduce yourself in the chat. Please share your name, your organization, and the country you're joining us from today. We also welcome your questions and reflections throughout the session. So feel free to use the Q&A or the chat box to send us your comments, your questions, and you don't have to wait until the Q&A session to do that. We'll be monitoring the Q&A and the chats throughout the webinar. Just a very quick look at our agenda today. We'll begin with an overview of some key IPV-related findings from last year's forum, and then this will be followed by moderated panel discussion with our invited speakers. We will then move into a live Q&A with your questions, and finally, we'll close with next steps and share more about the upcoming webinars that will take place in July. We're absolutely delighted to be joined today by four incredible panelists. I wish I had more time to read their full bios, but here's a very quick introduction in the order they'll be presenting. First, I'm sure you all know her, but is Liz Dartnell, who's the Executive Director of SVRI, and a public health specialist with over 20 years of experience in research and policymaking on health systems, mental health, and violence against children and women. Followed by Dr. Anjali Kohli, who's an applied researcher and consultant with more than 20 years of experience working with local and international organizations on VBV, VAC, SRHR, gender norms, and climate. She specializes in designing and implementing research to inform program design, evaluation, and scale up. Then we will hear from Dr. Rachel Duke, who is an executive scientist at the South African Medical Research Council based in Pretoria. She's an NRF A1 rated researcher and MRC gold medalist with over 30 years of leadership in social epidemiology, anthropology, and health systems research. Her work focuses primarily on gender-based violence and gender inequality. I should also mention that she is one of the co-founders of SVRI and the former director of DFID-funded What Works to Prevent Violence Consortia. And last but not least, we'll turn it over to Dr. Carrie Jo Clark, who's an associate professor of global health at the Rollins School of Public Health. Her work focuses on measuring the health impacts of child maltreatment at IPV, interrogating violence-related norms, and developing evidence-based prevention strategies. So to get us started, I'm going to turn it over to Liz Dartnell to share some high-level overview of forum findings that are related to intimate partner violence. So over to you, Liz.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, and welcome everybody for joining us on this discussion on intimate partner violence. I'd like to thank my AVP colleagues for partnering with us on this series and all the wonderful panelists for your generosity and time for joining us. Just to remind you, next slide, please, Liesl. SVRI Forum brought together 1,500 researchers and practitioners from 112 countries. And this presentation is a high-level overview of some of the research that's revealing that we need to really be thinking around our approach to IPV prevention and response. So next slide, please, Liesl. So I'm going to focus on 5 key high-level learnings from the forum that I think are, although on our radar, need to be really thought through more to help us in our work to respond to and prevent IPV. The first is tech-facilitated IPV. completely new forms of violence that did not exist a decade ago, requiring urgent response. The second is the climate violence nexus, emerging evidence that environmental stresses are increasing IPV vulnerabilities. And third, why longitudinal research is essential, from understanding the drivers of violence to measuring real program impact. Fourth, why our current funding and scaling systems really are not helping our interventions to be effective. And five, what we all really know, but find it so hard to do, is the importance of working in a more integrated way. So next slide, please, Liesl. So let's start with tech-facilitated intimate partner violence. As we discussed, as Nicholas mentioned, in webinar 1 of our series, we are seeing entirely new categories of violence: sextortion, where perpetrators blackmail victims using sexual content; image-based abuse, sharing intimate content without consent; and increasingly AI-enabled harassment using deep fakes and voice cloning. Perpetrators are using location tracking to victimize and re-victimize survivors and victims. But what we also know is tech isn't just creating problems, it's creating solutions as well. For example, shared at SVRI Forum 2024 was Brazil's Ayana chatbox, which is representing genuine innovation. It's an AI-driven tool providing legal and psychological support through intelligent search that understands what survivors are really asking for and connects them to services, tracks conversation history to provide personal responses, and was developed in partnership with survivors, which we call survivor-centered design. So the key insight is tech is evolving faster than our policy and program responses can keep up. And so we have to be more proactive rather than just reactive to harmful uses. And this requires urgent investment in survivor-centered digital solutions and legal frameworks that are keeping pace with the technological change that is happening at such a pace, and whilst at the same time continuing to build evidence. So next slide, please, Liesl. So the second insight I want to share is evidence on the climate violence nexus. At the forum, colleagues presented really important research showing that severe droughts in countries like Lesotho, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Mozambique are directly linked to increased violence against girls. In Lesotho, for example, teenage girls face an 11% additional risk of being HIV positive following drought crises. And the presenters identified clear mechanisms. When crops fail due to drought, families face economic stress that can trigger violence. When communities are displaced, protection systems break down, food becomes scarce, survival strategies often put women and girls at risk. And this isn't a future threat, it's happening now. And climate emergencies are becoming more frequent and more severe, and traditional prevention models aren't accounting for environmental stresses. So the insight is environmental stresses compound risk, and prevention must adapt to climate realities. So next slide, please, Liesl. As I mentioned, the third insight is why longitudinal research is essential, from understanding the drivers of violence to measuring real program impact. The Birth to 20+ study from South Africa that was presented at Forum followed participants from childhood to adulthood, showing us how early violence exposure shapes later IPV experiences. Longitudinal research, however, is also equally crucial for understanding whether our interventions are actually doing what we want them to be doing. Some apparent short-term successes don't always hold up over time. For example, while not an IPV study, initial findings from a study on corporal punishment called GAGE looked promising. It showed that corporal punishment was declining across 20,000 adolescents across 6 countries. However, they found that this decline wasn't due to shifting attitudes about corporal punishment. Participants were simply aging beyond the typical age range where such punishment occurs. So without long-term tracking, we sometimes mistake developmental changes for program success. This contrasts sharply with the Vanderberejo program's 6-year follow-up, which showed really incredible, sustained 55% reductions in physical IPV and 50% reductions in sexual IPV, showing that we can make lasting change, not just in violence, but also on relationships, parenting, and mental health. So again, the critical insight here is that many effective interventions that show promise in the short-term evaluations may not always hold up over time. And we're making scaling decisions often based on 12 to 18-month studies for interventions that may need years to show true impact. So we do know that investment in longitudinal research is not just a nice to have, but essential for really understanding of what is working and why and how. So the next insight. The fourth insight reveals a fundamental contradiction that we're facing in our field. We know from evidence that social norms change, as I've already mentioned, can take years of sustained effort. Yet findings presented at the forum found that 72% of organizations working on violence against women and violence against children in Africa receive grants of 1 year or less. This creates a fundamental mismatch between what evidence tells us works and how we're resourcing that work. Panels and discussions at the forum then also raised up 3 interconnected crises. First, a scaling crisis where programs are expanded too rapidly after a single positive study, resulting in the loss of core components that made them effective in the first place. Second, a funding crisis, which I've just spoken about, where many organizations receive only project-based funding, unable to build relationships or institutional capacity, which we know are fundamentally important for sustainable programming. And third, a time crisis where pressure for fast impact, and we understand the need to react fast and respond quickly, but this does contradict with community-led models that we know take time to work. So, for example, economic interventions are a good example of the importance of this type of long-term sustained programming. We know that giving cash coupled with behavior change training works, but the 9-year long Bangladesh study found that lasting intimate partner violence reduction depends on whether women maintained economic security after the program ended. So they found that if economic stability disappears when the program stops, they found that IPV rates could return to previous levels prior to when the intervention was done in the first place. And this study also is another reminder of why we need more long-term studies. So our insight here is that current systems are not always compatible with effective IPV programming. Next slide, please. Liesl. So the next insight is the power of integration. I want to highlight one more insight that cuts across all these issues. In day 2 plenary of the forum, Prof. Mary Ellsberg reminded us that where children experience violence, women often do too, and vice versa. Integrated approaches addressing both forms of violence together show significant promise and improved scalability compared to standalone programs. For example, in Syria, they adapted a program called Indashakira and achieved almost 50% reduction of IPV by engaging women, children, and communities together, not separately. And of course, this has to be done thoughtfully and carefully. But this approach demonstrates the potential for more efficient use of resources and creates opportunities to address shared risk factors. The insight here is that we cannot address IPV in isolation. Next slide, please, Liesl. So what do these insights demand? First, technology innovation. We need investment in survivor-centered AI and digital solutions based on evidence. Plus, we need legal frameworks that can keep pace with technological change. In terms of climate adaptation, we need IPV prevention programs in climate vulnerable regions that have built-in environmental considerations into their design from the beginning, and humanitarian responses need GBV expertise embedded from day one. Third, we need an evidence rethink and revolution. This is something we're going to be talking about today. We need to fund longitudinal studies, but we also need to rethink how we measure impact. And fourth, we need systems change. This means long-term core funding for organizations investing in scaling science before we scale programs. And we need to align funding cycles with actual timelines of social change rather than annual reporting cycles. And finally, integration. We need to break down silos across all forms of violence prevention, not just between IPV and childhood violence, but across sectors, issues, and the full spectrum of violence. This means unified programming that addresses the interconnected nature of violence, coordinated funding, and shared measurement systems that capture holistic outcomes. So, in sum, we have an evidence base that is stronger than ever before, something that we can be so proud of. We have a global community committed to change, and that is really important in times like now where we are struggling with the global environment. We are committed, we continue to work, and we have innovation that's happening across multiple fronts. So the question isn't whether we can end intimate partner violence, it's how we continue to learn from each other and from these learnings from the forum and this panel with the urgency, resources, and the collaboration they require. And so now I'm going to hand over to you, Liesl, to talk about the next forum, a very important place that we can discuss these questions and more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you so much for grounding us in the powerful findings of the forum and just explaining and talking about it in such a beautifully clear way. So before we move on to the presentations from our panelists, I am delighted to share the news that Forum 2026 is coming. We'll be gathering at the Centara Grand Hotel and Bangkok Convention Center at Central World, Thailand, from the 5th until the 9th of October 2026. This will be a truly global moment for researchers, practitioners, activists, survivors, policymakers, funders to come together to connect, share, and learn. Abstract submissions and registration will open in August 2025, so please stay tuned via our website and our social media for more details. We can't wait to welcome you there. And with that, Nicholas, back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz and Liesl, for that fantastic overview of some emerging insights and also sharing about the next forum. There were just so many great sessions last year, and it's wonderful to see that high-level summary to set the scene for today's session as well. We now turn it over to Dr. Anjali Kohli, who will share findings from Rwanda and Senegal on how men and women report IPV differently and why these reporting gaps matter for both research and programming. So over to you.
Thank you, Nicholas. And hello, everyone. I want to thank SVRI for organizing this event. I'm grateful for these efforts to share research findings to a wider community of people. I'm presenting today on behalf of a team from Plan International in the US, Rwanda, and Senegal, and Georgetown University. Next slide, please. The analysis I am presenting today comes from the baseline studies of an integrated household violence prevention program called Real Fathers. Our overall study examined whether the program led to reductions in men's use of IPV and parents' use of harsh discipline against their young children. As we had data on men's reports of IPV and women's experience of IPV, we became interested in whether men and women reported IPV similarly. Though few studies have examined concordance for IPV reporting, we understood that discordance was likely to be common with women reporting IPV more often than men. Next slide, please. Our objective then was to explore the patterns of concordance and discordance in couples' reports of male to female psychological, physical, and sexual IPV in the past 3 months, and to explore whether sociodemographic factors were associated with couples' concordant reporting of IPV versus discordant reporting of IPV. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, our study comes from the baseline data of the Real Fathers evaluation. We included 330 couple dyads in southeastern Senegal and 315 couple dyads in southern and eastern Rwanda. Our eligibility criteria reflected the program focus, which is young fathers who are married or living with a female partner, who are committed to participating in the program, and a resident of the selected communities. Next slide. So briefly, our study was reviewed and approved at different levels, including a local advisory board that was formed to pay specific attention to ethics, sensitivity, and women's safety, given that we were interviewing both men and women. We also engaged a community advisory board and received IRB approvals in each country and from Georgetown University. Next slide. So we examined 3 types of IPV. We used measures from the WHO study, so psychological, physical, and sexual IPV. For IPV, we used a 3-month recall period, which aligned with the end line of what we needed to measure for the end line evaluation to show change. And then for frequency of IPV, we used a 1-month recall period. We also looked at acceptability of IPV, descriptive and injunctive IPV norms, and then other variables shown on this slide. Next slide, please. We defined 2 types of concordance. So one where male and female partners both report IPV, and the other where both male and female partners both report that there is no IPV. And then we define two types of discordance, where the female partner is the only one reporting the IPV, and the second, where the male partner is the only one reporting IPV. So we kept each of these categories separate because we considered them distinct. And then after looking at concordance overall, we used both bivariate and multivariate logistic regression just to look at patterns of discordance and concordance. Next slide. So I'll spend a little time here on this slide. Here we show the patterns of concordance and discordance across different types of IPV. I've circled the data that are the focus of this analysis just to highlight where to place your eyes. But we can see that in both Rwanda and in Senegal, it was most common for both men and women to agree that there was no IPV. So for example, in Rwanda, 46% of women and men reported no IPV, and in Senegal, 43% reported the same. But in situations where women do report IPV, discordance in reporting was the most common, with women reporting all types of IPV and any IPV, but not their male partner. So if we look at Rwanda, we can see 28% of women report IPV, but not their male partner. And then we can look across and see 21% of women report physical IPV, 18% report sexual, and 19% report psychological IPV, but not their male partner. And we can see a similar pattern in Senegal. This pattern holds, as you can see, for all types of IPV in both countries. The greatest difference we saw in discordance was with sexual IPV. So for example, in Senegal, 23% of women reported sexual IPV, but not their male partner, whereas concordance was only amongst 1% of those experiencing IPV. Next slide. So this slide shows the results from our bivariate regression in Rwanda and Senegal. I won't spend too much time on it, but you can see that the first two columns show higher odds of discordant reporting, and the next two columns show lower odds of discordant reporting. Here we see men who consider their relationship very good in both Rwanda and Senegal had greater odds of not reporting IPV when it occurred. And then also in Rwanda, men who used coercive behaviors had greater odds of discordant reporting, meaning they didn't report IPV when their partner did. Lower odds of discordance was associated with men who held attitudes of accepting IPV, drinking alcohol, injunctive norms, or having more children. Next slide. So here we show the results from the Rwanda multivariate regression, where we included variables that were significant in the bivariate analysis or we hypothesized to be important. This isn't the full model, I'm just highlighting where there were significant variables. We see that men who perceived their relationship to be very good had significantly greater odds of discordant reporting, meaning they didn't report IPV when their partner did. And men who considered IPV acceptable or typical in a community had greater odds of concordant reporting, meaning they reported IPV when their partner reported IPV. Next slide. In Senegal, we saw a different pattern. Here, the odds of concordance in men's and women's reports of IPV was greater when men used coercive behaviors, considered IPV sometimes acceptable, or experienced some insecurity in the past month. So next slide. Next, we examined if there was a relationship between concordance in IPV reporting and the frequency of experiencing IPV. In other words, we wanted to know if men and women were more likely to report IPV occurrence when IPV occurred more frequently in the relationship. Next slide. So here you can see the results of the analysis where we show the mean frequency of IPV in the past month as our measure of frequency of IPV. A couple other studies have shown that concordance is greater when women report experiencing more IPV, when women report experiencing IPV more often in the relationship. Our study, though, did not find a significant difference in IPV concordance with more frequent IPV. And we suspect this could be because we used a 1-month recall period for frequency of IPV, and therefore we may not have been able to capture enough variation in the data to actually unpack this. Next slide. So just to summarize, we found that concordance was the most common when there was no IPV in the relationship. But amongst couples where IPV does occur, discordance was the most common experience, where women report IPV but not men for any and all types of IPV. And men who had considered IPV acceptable had a greater odds of concordant reporting. Next slide. So just a few limitations to note. We used a short recall period for IPV, which was past 3 months, to align with the evaluation design. And we used a short recall period for frequency of IPV, which was past 1 month. So we suspect, though cannot confirm, that if we used longer recall periods, we may have seen more IPV in the data, and this may show different results than what we're seeing here. We also included a sample of men who wanted to participate in a fatherhood program, meaning there's a social desirability bias, or a risk of it at least, that people who are participating in the program may want to report data in a particular way, or may feel a need to. And we may be capturing men who are more willing to report IPV just based on their willingness to participate in a fatherhood intervention, even if it's not advertised as an IPV prevention intervention. Next slide. So our conclusions, we found that discordant reporting, if measuring data just amongst men in terms of their use of IPV, we're likely to get much lower reports of IPV, at least based on this study. And this has some implications for future research and programming that I want to highlight. One is we don't really understand why there is such high discordance in the data. Do IPV norms affect how men and women are reporting IPV? How does IPV acceptability or perceived acceptability at the individual level affect reporting? And does relationship quality or social desirability bias affect what we're seeing? For programming, we were curious about whether this data might be useful in thinking about entry points for programming. Does programming, thinking about positive programming, working on gender and power, as many programs do, open a possible entry point, especially when men aren't perceiving or reporting that they're using violence? And how important is it that the report of past, how important is this over time? So if men are discordant at the beginning of a study, we don't really know what's happening at our end line. We didn't look at that yet to see, was there any change in concordance or discordance? So as men learn more, do they change how they report? I'll stop there. I think I'm running close to time. So thank you.
Thank you so much, and to your team for the research and that wonderful presentation on partner reporting patterns and what they truly reveal about how IPV is not only experienced, but also disclosed. Lots of food for thought there. Again, the Q&A is open, so please feel free to send us your questions. So next, we'll hear from Dr. Rachel Juk, who will take us into the world of research on intergenerational violence, sharing new research on how South African women recall witnessing IPV in childhood and how those experiences continue to shape lives today. So over to you, Doctor.
Thank you very much. And I want to start by acknowledging my team who are presented here on the slides and our funder, the Wellcome Trust, and thank all of you for coming to the webinar today and SVRI for organising it. So I have been working on looking at the way in which witnessing abuse is measured. When we're talking about witnessing abuse of IPV in childhood. And we know that witnessing abuse against one's mother, as well as experiencing other forms of childhood trauma, are key risk factors for women experiencing IPV and men perpetrating as adults. And there are different pathways. So one of the key ways in which this impacts is through social learning of the normativity of IPV, as well as of women's subordination to men, and associations between ideas of manhood, power, and violence. But there are also a range of indirect impacts. So the first one is obviously on the child, and exposure very often is associated and leads to poor mental health, impaired neurocognitive development, and lower educational attainment, which has lifelong implications. And there are a myriad of impacts of mothers being exposed to IPV on their parenting because of the effects of IPV on mothers, particularly, again, coming to mental health effects. Next slide. Research that's been conducted with men in the United Nations multi-country study on men and violence in Asia and the Pacific has shown that both childhood trauma and witnessing maternal IPV are important drivers of IPV perpetration. And what I show here is a structural equation model that shows that. And I think it's very important because often we talk about one of them and not the two of them together as driving IPV. And I want you to keep the thought that we need to keep them both in our minds when we're thinking about drivers together, because they co-occur so often, but they're slightly different. We know less about the vulnerability of women than from some of the research that's being conducted with men. When we look at work that's been done over the years, and we're talking to women about whether they've experienced IPV when they were children, very often what we see is that a single measure is single item measure is used to capture that experience. And this, for example, is used in the WHO questionnaire. And it's got obviously severe limitations. So the first is that we know that IPV has many different forms, and all of the acts of emotional abuse that a mother might experience are missed from that. We also know that many people don't live in a nuclear family across most of the world. We have a whole range of other women who are around in our home when we grow up. And the measure doesn't really capture any other witnessing of IPV that might have taken place in childhood. And then another issue is that the notion of witnessing isn't really problematized in the notion in the item, and whether it was IPV was seen, was heard, or whether it was something you were told about isn't really unpacked, and we don't know if that makes a difference. So obviously, if a mother experiences IPV, it doesn't matter whether the child sees it, it's going to impact on the mother's mental health. But in other situations, it may be very important that the child sees it, particularly if it's going to be a pathway related to social learning that we're concerned about. So we had the opportunity in South Africa to go back and do a bit of a rethink around how we measure witnessing IPV. And we've developed a measure that's much closer to the WHO Violence Against Women questionnaire and asks about IPV experienced by mothers as well as by other family members, starts to problematize witnessing. And so what I want to do is to describe the measure and the types of reports that we've got in our sample and show some of the associations. The data I am presenting comes from the Fiducia Mrikologo cohort study, and it's going to be a cohort of 12,000 women. We've recruited about half of them, but I'm only presenting data on 1,463 interviews today. It's a non-probability study, and we're recruiting the women in 4 sites in South Africa. And we've been using a sort of either referral from services or from door-to-door knocking, or a chain referral using coupons. And there's a little coupon shown here. Next slide. The eligibility for the study it requires women to be 18 to 45 years. They should be currently partnered or have had a partner in the last year that they still fear. And they should have experienced severe IPV, whether physical, sexual, threats to harm, or severe controlling behavior. Next slide. So in the study, we implemented this new measure of looking at witnessing IPV. And you can see the questions here. We've got 4 emotional items and 3 physical items. And we ask whether whether the behavior was seen or heard in childhood, whether the woman was told when she was a child that it had occurred. And we asked about whether the participant in our study had witnessed their mother experiencing these forms of IPV, or whether they had witnessed another female relative. And I think what you can see here really clearly is that more women had witnessed these against another female relative than had witnessed them against their mother. but in total, about half of the women in our sample had experienced, witnessed emotional IPV perpetrated against either their mother or a female relative at home. When we look at physical IPV, we see that about a third of women have witnessed their mother being slapped. And this question's much more similar to the type of item we normally have in the WHO questionnaire. But we see it's actually half of the women in our sample who have witnessed this type of violence when we're looking at it and asking about all female relatives within the home. And again, if you look at severe violence or being killed, we see 1 in 5 had witnessed that against their mother, but it's a third of the sample who'd witnessed it against another female relative. So I think what we show here is that our conventional question actually quite substantially underestimates the overall exposure to both physical and emotional IPV that children very often have when they're growing up, as shown from our sample. Next slide, please. Next slide. So this slide shows the psychometric properties of the measure, and what you can see is that all of the items for physical IPV load on a single factor, and an emotional IPV, and you've got different factors for the other female relative as well as the mother. And we confirmed this by examining the discriminant validity and confirmatory factor analysis. So this looks good. Next slide. We then wanted to have a look at how these measures correlated with women's own reports of IPV. And what was interesting is that we found that when we looked at it overall, that witnessing IPV against the mother or against physical relative, another female relative when the items were combined wasn't actually associated. But if you unpack them, you can see the reason is that physical IPV was associated with an enhanced risk of participants themselves experiencing physical IPV. But emotional IPV is actually operating in the opposite direction. I'm not going to go into that further now, but it clearly leads to some important questions for the future. Next slide, please. We also wanted to look at whether witnessing abuse was correlated with PTSD, and I'm presenting complex PTSD as well, because this is particularly appropriate as a measure for a multiple trauma-exposed population. And what's interesting is that we actually see that when we look at the pooled measure here, and we adjust for the women's own experiences of physical and sexual IPV and other childhood trauma, that actually witnessing isn't associated. But if you go to the next slide, I'll show you that if we look at the women who have witnessed severe IPV against their mother, we see that this is very strongly associated with complex PTSD. And that is exactly what you would expect to see, because this is the most, must be the most traumatic experience for our participants when they were children. So just to complete, next slide. I think what we've shown is that our new measures at the very least open up new avenues for understanding the impact of witnessed IPV in childhood, and the analyses support the value of measuring emotional and physical and severe IPV exposures. The findings also show that nuclear family assumptions around exposure underestimate the impactful exposure to IPV in childhood. And they suggest that the type and severity of IPV may be more important than which women experienced it for intergenerational cycling of IPV, and that we need to be open to the idea that some exposures may operate in different directions for some health outcomes. So exposure to childhood trauma as well is a very important co-occurring exposure, and we must measure it and we must adjust for it in our analyses when we're looking at the impact of witnessing IPV. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I think the approach to measuring childhood exposure to IPV and its connection to later experiences of violence as well really offers critical and very timely evidence for improving not only research, but also programming. So thank you very much. We will now turn it over to Dr. Carrie Jo, who will explore whether the tools that we rely on to measure IPV are really doing the job and what happens when our data collection methods fall short. So over to you.
Thank you. So team, I know I'm last but not least, as they said, so we've got a few more minutes to add to the amazing content that you have already heard from our previous speakers. I just want to start by acknowledging collaborators on this project and the funding for this project. Next slide, please. So what I want to take you through today is an examination of whether or not the tools that we most commonly use to evaluate prevention interventions are working as we expect them to, because they are the workhorse and our primary and secondary outcomes. So, you know, those of us in the field, testing interventions to reduce and prevent IPV has accelerated considerably over the last few decades with enormous amounts of support. I say that, but we have not kept the measurement work up at the same pace. Psychometric analysis of the IPV victimization and perpetration scales lag behind considerably. And when we think about the measure that we most often use, which is some form of the conflict tactic scales or its revision, the conflict tactic scale was originally developed in the 1970s in the US, and while it has been used all over the world, it has not been tested in terms of whether it is effective measure. It holds psychometric properties in intervention studies. So this is the purpose of this analysis. And next slide, please. So what did we do to test this out? So this is a secondary measurement of variance analysis of data from the first What Works studies that Rachel Jukes had led with large consortia. And we have benefited greatly from the fact that these studies are publicly available in terms of their data, therefore a secondary analysis. And if I repeat that again, please post your data. It's critical for these types of investigations. So when we look at the types of studies that we included in our study, they were panel design, they had to have repeat measurement of individual level IPV victimization or perpetration, and they had to have a control arm. In terms of women's victimization, we had a total of 4 studies, and you can see the countries there, and about a little over 3,000 individual persons, but the size of the studies varied greatly. In terms of men's perpetration, we also see we had 3 studies to work with, 1 in Rwanda and 2 in South Africa, and you see a similar range in study sizes there. Next slide, please. So these are, across the studies, these are the items that we had to work with. We had victimization, which we had 5 items of physical IPV consistently used across all of the studies for women's victimization. In terms of sexual IPV, we had between 0 and 5 items used across the different studies. In terms of perpetration, again, we see the same 5 items used consistently across the studies. And in terms of for sexual IPV, we had between 3 and 4 items. Now, some of these, there were some wording changes. In some were dropped in perpetration. So, sorry, now I'm getting off track here. Needless to say, there is always a little bit of tinkering. And while everyone tells you that please don't do this, the context may dictate that some tinkering is necessary, and that is the case for a number of the items. Next slide, please. So what did we do? We did the typical descriptive analysis. We did exploratory factor analysis on each of these studies on a random split half. We used confirmatory analysis of the best fitting models from the exploratory factor analysis on the other random split half. Then we used multi-group confirmatory factor analysis to test whether or not the measurement properties were the same across time, across arms, and across studies where indicated. Then we computed the average treatment effects, adjusting for covariate imbalance to check to see if we were able to replicate the original study's findings and whether or not any invariance that we did detect impacted the conclusions made from the study. Next slide. So here's a basic description in terms of prevalence for IPV victimization and perpetration. You'll see all of them have substantial amounts of perpetration and victimization in terms of data to work with. Next slide. So when we think of the women's findings, so in terms of the factor structure, we see that the physical and sexual IPV items loaded on separate factors across all 4 studies. So you have a physical structure factor and a sexual factor. When we look at whether or not cross-arm scalar invariance was supported, yes, we say yes. So across all 4 studies, they performed the same across arm at baseline and end line for all of the studies. Then we looked, was cross-time scalar invariance supported? And we say scalar because scalar is the degree to which you need to find invariance for you to be able to compare the estimates. So as you see there in terms of the results, we say generally invariance was fully supported for 1 study and partially supported in the remaining 3. You see a couple of items there, hit and slap, needed us to make some minor adjustments to the models to make them approximately invariant. So the last question for the women's findings are, is this degree of approximate invariance, does it impact the findings in terms of what we saw in the primary outcome papers? And for the women, we see that these small modifications that we had to make made very small differences in the treatment, in the effect estimates, no changes in direction or significance. And we saw that the magnitude of the impact, as we said, was very small, and it was much smaller than, for example, covariate imbalance. So that having unbalanced arms at baseline had a much stronger impact on inference compared to whether or not we found a little bit of invariance. Next slide, please. Now on to the men. This whole group knows that men are harder to get to participate in research, but we still assume that our items work the same. And for men, we can say no. So in terms of the factor structure, for men, a 2-factor physical and sexual IPV was supported. We did see a fair amount of cross-loading, which means that, for example, weapon cross-loaded on the sexual factors in 2 studies, and porn, being forced to watch porn, cross-loaded on physical IPV factor in 1 study. But overall, we see that the fit was good or good enough for physical and sexual factor for the men. When we look at whether or not cross-arm invariance was supported, and this, again, yes, similar to women, we find across arms that these scales are performing similarly across the intervention and control arms. When we look over time, we see that the answer is no. It's only in the control arm. In 2 studies, we didn't achieve scalar invariance in the treatment arm despite multiple modifications. So there are predetermined modifications that you might make, and then there are post hoc. And in our manuscript, you will see clearly the range of theoretically relevant and empirically justified attempts at trying to see if there was a way that we could make the study work, and we simply could not. So our last question is, does this invariance affect the outcome of the study? We couldn't test it in 2 studies. One, we didn't need to, it was fully invariant. One study, we could not identify an invariant model in which to test this. But overall, in terms of treatment estimates, we could replicate them, but we really couldn't test this last question out simply because there was no need to test it because we did not have the same model across the different studies. Next slide, please. So, of course, some of the limitations of this analysis is that we're using the English translations of the items. And across all the studies, there were a variety of languages that were used. There were a small number of items that we had to work with because the scales we most often work with, as you saw, the physical items are 5 and the sexual violence items are 0 to 3, which are very, very small. We also we were limited by some of the wording changes, having to make decisions if a teeny wording change still meant the item meant the same thing, or if it did truly change the item and we could not use it. So in terms of strengths, this study is the first of its kind to examine these issues within evaluations. So when psychometric testing has been done, it's been done to assess what the factor structure is, used often in a cross-sectional study design. We also have diverse prevention programming that were being tested out in these different studies. And we are looking at the most commonly used measure for IPV surveillance and intervention testing. So hopefully bringing some knowledge to what is widespread use of this scale. Next slide. So overall, we see that particularly for women's IPV, that even when we had a small, what we would call just a slight deviation from full invariance, it really did not have an impact on the results. We did, it's just best not to change things whenever you can. Although our findings really show that we need more items. We literally need more items to work with because when we have 0, obviously we can't test that, or 1 or 2, we're really too far below the threshold of content validity. So we are using very small scales as primary, secondary outcomes on a number of our most important studies. But saying this, I say that we need to replicate these study findings in different settings across a wider range of contexts and with different measures of IPV. Next slide. So quickly, in terms of recommendations, avoid making ad hoc changes to scales when at all possible. We definitely need to spend more time identifying an item set, especially for men's perpetration that does function similarly across contexts. We need to enhance the content validity and so we can get a better sense of severity and broaden our examination of IPV victimization and perpetration beyond its current very heteronormative framing and expand it to other IPV forms. And frankly, if to the extent that is possible, that if you could all of us could do more measurement of variance testing, that would strengthen trial inference for each study in which they could do that. And it would identify situations in which measurement non-invariance is potentially meaningful and therefore worth the additional effort, as well as if it's not at all necessary and it's making very little impact on treatment decisions. And overall, greatly enhance our collective understanding about the nature and extent of IPV globally. Thank you.
Thank you so much for raising such important questions about how we measure IPV and what's at stake when our tools simply don't hold up across contexts or study something that's also very relevant beyond the IPV space. And I think these findings really push us to reflect on the foundations of how we generate and also apply evidence. That concludes our presentations. Thank you again for this 4 wonderful presentations, and we'll now open it up for questions. And I'm seeing some questions in the chat. So there's one from Arwa who raised a great point about how difficult it is to measure IPV in contexts where authorities restrict data collection, especially in settings like refugee camps, informal settlements, or among homeless populations. Have you experienced that in your research? And what are some strategies or considerations for conducting ethical, rigorous research in this highly constrained environments? So whoever wants to take that first, and please try to keep it brief. Dr. Duke, maybe we'll start with you, if you don't mind.
I think that measuring IPV can be challenging in many contexts, and we need to be incredibly careful about the issues around the safety of conducting the research. And it becomes more acute in settings, particularly in conflict-related settings and in refugee camps, where there tends to be a high level of tension, and very often you've got arms around, and so the implications for women could be quite severe. So I think you need to be very sensitive. You need to be very careful about the prerequisites for making sure that it's done in a way that participants' privacy is protected. But we know that in every setting, that if we create a supportive environment, that women will disclose experiences of IPV. So it's not like, I don't think we're aware of any setting where it isn't possible to conduct the research. I think the onus is on doing it safely. And now there has been so much work done on measuring women's experience and men's perpetration of violence that we really do have a strong body of knowledge about how to do it that we need to continue to build on.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we have another question from Nandini in the chat about women who use drugs, particularly in South Asia and Southeast Asia, often face extremely high rates of IPV, yet remain largely overlooked in research and programming. What are your thoughts on how the field can better respond to this gap? So maybe Dr. Joe Clark or Dr. Colley, if you would like to respond to that.
I can jump in a bit. In terms of women's use of substances, honestly, I would say in terms of the work, I would concur in terms of its importance. But in terms of dealing with it, I can't even explain why, except for many of our interventions don't even touch on that factor. The closest that we come to, I think, is I would say rather excessive alcohol use, and we find that alcohol use in settings all over the world is associated with severity of intimate partner violence and its occurrence. And it's something that I think as a field that we have begun to incorporate much more intensively into the interventions. But in terms of drug use, not so much at all, but very worthy, as you mentioned.
Thank you. Dr. Colley, anything to add to that?
No, I agree with everything Carrie said. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And the next question in the chat comes from Rosina. I think this is directed to Dr. Rachel Duke. When boys witness IPV against their mothers during childhood, what do we know about the long-term impacts? Are they more likely to experience PTSD or to become victims or perpetrators themselves?
Well, they're certainly at risk of PTSD, just as girls are. But we know that their risk of long-term perpetration is also mediated by the impact of exposure on their mental health. And so that if they do witness abuse in childhood and experience PTSD, it provides a pathway for understanding that heightened risk of IPV perpetration subsequently. And we understand it as magnifying men's risk of subsequently using violence because of the well-documented mental health impact of exposure and association between particularly PTSD and subsequent perpetration, but also depression, which again can be another part of the pathway.
Thank you so much. We're almost out of time, but I really appreciated the discussion today. So I will now turn it over to Liz to close the webinar. And also maybe a quick question for you, Liz, from me. If there's one shift you'd like to see in how IPV is measured or addressed over the next 5 years, what would it be? So a quick response, and then please close the session.
Thank you. Thanks, Nicholas. It would be really great to have, I think going back to Carrie's point around the importance of measuring multiple types of violences in our studies and including different forms of violence and measuring them as outcomes. So thanks, Nicholas, and thank you everybody on this panel. I want to thank you all for joining us here today for this really enriching conversation on intimate partner violence. And the presentations and discussions at the forum really show us that the question's no longer that whether or not we can end it, but how do we build on what we've learned both today and from the forum. I want to thank the Australian Volunteers Program for co-funding this series. And thank you, Anjali, Rachel, and Carrie, for your generosity of being with us today and sharing your times, insights, and learnings. I think it's so important that we know how to better measure the impact of our interventions and whether or not they're doing what we want them to be doing and working in the right direction. And I think there's so much more we can really drill into, like what you were talking about, Rachel, around the importance of measuring emotional violence and how it might not be moving in the direction that we want it to. Love to know more about that. Thank you, Nicholas, for guiding today's session with such clarity and care, and to Liesl and Tenyiko for producing today's event. Thank you. So we need to stay connected and keep building the field together. And so we're going to invite you to SVRI Forum 2026, which we hope you will all be there. It's going to be in Bangkok from the 5th to the 9th of October. Abstract submissions and registrations open in August. The applications for hosting a pre-conference workshop is already open, and we really hope you to see you there. And just one final word. We know that ending IPV requires sustained effort, doing a lot, doing it often, and doing over a long period of time. And above all, it requires working together in a more integrated and collaborative way. And let's come together at the forum and have all those discussions on how we can do that. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.